Before we begin this Microsoft Digital event, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and work throughout Australia, as well as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people viewing this event today. We pay our respects to elders both past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate their continuing connection to land, waters and community. Our reverence also extends to all First Nation and Indigenous peoples, as well as their ancestral lands.
Hi everybody and welcome to the new Breakpoint. My name's Simon Waite. It's great to be back, and if you're joining us again, welcome back. If it's your first time, you're in for a great episode. As always, if you want to ask any questions during today's show, please use the Q&A box that you'll find on your screen to ask questions, and we'll answer them either during the episode or at the live Q&A at the end of the show. And if we don't have time, also check out our show notes, which I'll share the link to at the end of the show, where we often follow up with additional questions and answers that come out during the show. So today's guest is Paul Foster from Red Hat. Paul is a global black belt based in the Asia Pacific region, and he focuses on helping people do more with Azure Red Hat OpenShift and other Red Hat products. He's going to talk to us today about using a GitOps approach to managing your Kubernetes environment and applications. And it's going to be a really great session. I've had a sneak peek of the content, and I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into it. All right, now I'm joined by Paul Foster from Red Hat. Welcome to New Breakpoint, Paul.
Thanks, Simon. Great to be here.
Hey, look, I know you've got a stack of stuff to get through today. I think the word you've already used to describe this to me is hectic. I want to be a participant in this. I'm going to go off stream and watch this and hand over to you. But I'm really looking forward to this. So, Paul, without further ado, over to you.
Thanks, Simon. That's great. Yeah, lot to get through today. This is going to be level 9000. We're talking about CI/CD here. We're talking about GitOps and Service Mesh on Arrow clusters in the cloud, in Azure, the Azure cloud. Ultimately, what I'm talking about today is deploying a single application, but it's more of a holistic approach to a complete CI/CD solution that would manage teams and many applications in the cloud, right, on Kubernetes clusters. The application I've ripped off today is straight off the internet. It's called Online Boutique. I've seen it doing the rounds in quite a lot of demos lately. It's great because it's got 11 microservices, right? And I wanted to showcase, what does a major multi-microservice, multi-environment CI/CD process look like at a financial institution or a major organization, right? Let's get into it. I've got a slide here which is going to talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. First up, we're doing I love Helm. What is it? I do love Helm. It's a fantastic packaging tool. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk a little bit about the fundamentals of GitOps and CI and Argo CD. And then we're talking about branching and merging and webhooks. So these first three things that we're going to talk about are kind of like, building blocks of knowledge, I guess. I'm hoping you've got a fair bit of experience with these things already, but we're just going to touch over them for those that don't. And then we're going to get into the solution. So this is the next one's specifically about my solution. I use a single repo to drive to organize all my teams or product lines or whatever they are, and then drive their applications through that organization, all driven from a single repository. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the Tecton pipelines that I've created. I use 3 Tecton pipelines throughout this solution. I GitOps my pipelines and I reuse them over and over again between applications to drive down costs, to drive down my labor. And we're going to talk about that. And finally, we're going to talk about my GitOps flowchart, where hopefully it will tie everything in together. I use for loops to deliver my entire CI/CD solution, Helm for loops. Okay, so it's a unique sort of way of doing it, but for me, it's the best way I've seen to do it. But before we get into it, we need to build a cluster, right? And we're going to build an Arrow cluster and kick off my solution. Because I use for loops, I tie my entire application builds, all my builds for all my applications into the cluster build, right, in this demo. Okay, They are just Helm charts. One Helm chart installs all the other Helm charts. So here we are in a GitHub repository. This was actually built by a colleague of mine. He put this together as a great way to build Arrow clusters. We're using GitHub Actions today. I'm not going to spend too much time in here. I just wanted to look at the workflows. And in the workflow, I'm deploying a public Arrow cluster. And like I said, we are going to be building some Arrow networking. We are then going to be deploying a OpenShift Arrow cluster, which is a managed service as part of the Azure marketplace. Okay. Then we're going to do some configuration of my cluster. Okay. And that's where I'm talking about deploying my operators and the initial configuration and my first Helm chart, which is going to trigger the deployment of my entire GitOps solution. Okay, so let's get stuck into it. It takes 40 minutes, or probably not even, probably half an hour to build the cluster, but we go into Actions and we can kick off the build of my cluster. Run workflow. So I'm going to kick this off, and then we're going to come back, and hopefully we're going to have an Arrow cluster that we can play with and have a look at. Okay, so we're back. The GitHub Actions pipeline has completed. It's spun off my resource group, my Arrow VNet, and my Red Hat Arrow OpenShift cluster. Now, as I said earlier, we're going to talk largely through a deck today. So I'm going to flick over the deck now and let's get stuck in. All of these things about Helm are the things that are important to my solution here today. And most of, I'm hoping you're kind of familiar with Helm. When we're talking about GitOps and when we're talking about Argo CD and using Helm with those products, Argo CD does a thing called templating, right? And there's a command within Helm where you can run a Helm template. And basically, it's like it's like a dry run of your templating. Helm is a packaging tool, a templating tool for YAML manifests. And by using the templating command, we are seeing what would be substituted into our templates if we ran the package as it was right now, right? And Argo CD does something similar, right? It doesn't actually install Helm charts into your Kubernetes cluster, right? It does some sort of templating on it, and then it diffs this against what's on the Kubernetes cluster, right? And it whatever the delta is, it applies that to the cluster. Helm also has a values file, right, where you put in all your values. Your templates generally remain static with the YAML manifest, and your values files will change between environments, right? Helm charts can exist in two places. They always exist in two places, really. Helm in Git, right? You've got your Helm chart in Git where you're creating the Helm chart, but then you also publish Helm charts to Helm repositories, right? So it can exist in two places. And in my CI/CD solution, I am going to be using both. I use a revisioned Helm chart in a Helm repo where I want something that is stable, right? I use a Helm chart in a Git repository where the values will constantly be changing, right? Where I don't want to constantly publish a new version of the Helm chart, right? And that brings me on to revisions, right? Helm charts have revisions, right? My Helm charts, the way I do things, I use semantic versioning, and we increment the revisions as the Helm charts change, as those templates change, right? The big one on the left here is ranges, and this may be a new concept to some people. I love Helm, right? No, as I said it at the top, it's a fantastic packaging tool, and on Kubernetes, I find I don't need anything else, right, to deliver applications. It's fantastic, and what I love about it is a packaging and templating tool, but you also have the ability to run simple bash things inside of these charts, right? Ranges is for loops, right? I'm going to be using for loops within my Helm chart to drive my CI/CD solution, and it is kind of unique. It might be new to some people, but it's fundamental to how I deliver applications using Argo CD onto OpenShift clusters. Right. Up next, we're talking about GitOps and Argo CD and just some basic fundamentals about them, right? So what is GitOps? GitOps is an operational framework, right? It's a methodology, right? It fosters DevOps best practices, right? And is applied to infrastructure and applications via CI/CD. Essentially what it is from a Kubernetes point of view, is we're taking the power of Kubernetes ephemeral workloads and we're marrying it up to the power of Git and version control software. We're adding the two things together. What is Argo CD, right? As the name suggests, CD, it's about continuous delivery part of the CI/CD process, right? And on this screen, I've put together a little slide around some of the fundamentals I want you to take away in preparation for absorbing my CI/CD process, right? So here I've got an Arrow cluster. Well, I've got many Arrow clusters. Yep, I've put a few blocks in there. Argo CD can manage multiple clusters, right? Argo CD has some concepts called projects, and it has another concept called applications, right? An application has a one-to-one mapping with a Helm chart in our case, right? As I said earlier, a Helm chart can exist in several places, right? It can exist in a Helm repository where it's been published to. It can also exist in the Git repository where you created it, right? And as I said, in my CI/CD solution, I pull charts from both places, right? It's a one-to-one mapping. Every Argo CD application is assigned to a project, right? The project part of Argo CD is all about control, right? User access. It's about applying RBAC controls. What namespaces can these applications be deployed to? What repos can they connect to? Okay. So the project is about control. The application is about, the mechanism to deliver the Helm chart to the Kubernetes cluster, right? And it, underneath the covers, right, a project, an Argo CD application, it's just more YAML, right? These can also be GitOps, right? So I've got Argo CD installed on my Arrow cluster. In OpenShift, it's called OpenShift GitOps. It is Argo CD. It's a supported vendor-driven version of Argo CD. It's highly secured, right, and a few extra bells and whistles. And I've got this little thing down here about diffing and syncing. Because, like I said, Argo CD is going to reach out to consume these Helm charts, marry up the values files with those Helm charts, and then compare that to what's on the cluster, and it will whatever the delta is, it will resolve that and apply that to the cluster, right? And that essentially is what Argo CD does. Next up, I'm going to do a quick whiz through some of the webhooks I'm using to drive my solution. As I said earlier, essentially, I do CD with Argo CD, but the CI component I'm going to be driving with Tecton, and that's another product that comes baked into OpenShift. It's called OpenShift pipelines, and to drive these pipelines, we need webhooks. Okay. So what webhooks do I use? Well, I'm using GitHub today, and the webhooks I fundamentally use, there's 3 of them. There's actually a 4th one if I was running in production. But let's just walk through the first few. So you may have a protected branch. I hope you understand what a protected branch is. You take a feature branch and then you can make a pull request. On the pull request, we can drive a pipeline, right? We can drive a webhook. The sort of things I drive off the pull request hook are things like Terraform, right? I want to run a Terraform plan off my new feature branch where I've changed some IAC, right? Liquibase, right? Maybe I've made some updates to a schema, right? But I want to know what's going to happen when I run my pipeline, right? What changes is it actually going to make, right? I've changed the SQL. What's it actually going to changes it's actually going to make? Now, this sort of scenario where you've got the pull request hook before you actually merge in allows me to review this, right? So when I want to review something, this is the webhook I'm using. So then we apply the merge, and the merge, we generate another webhook, right? So we've checked what we're going to do, fine, merge it in, and then drive the next webhook. And now we're going to do something, right? So I'm doing my Terraform apply here, right? I'm doing my Liquibase apply, right? Make those changes to the schema. Another type of webhook I'm using today is the release, right? I use this for artifact promotion, right? Primarily in my solution today, I'm using it about delivering a container, right, to a container registry, but also to promote that to my live solution. Okay. Now, some people might just use a push webhook here, right, to do trunk-based delivery of their applications. I'm agnostic about this, right? I use a tag and release. I could also use a push notification here, where you just want to commit code to your repository, and every time you commit, you generate a new container. Okay, I don't care either way. I use release. Finally, there is this push, what I was just talking about. I use this, another one of my pipelines. I actually have 3 pipelines I'm going to be talking about today. The push I use for all my Helm charts. My whole solution depends on Helm charts and publishing Helm charts to Helm repositories. When our Helm charts change, I have a pipeline that will, if the version of the Helm chart has incremented, it will publish the chart, and I do this off a push to a Git repository. Okay, I did talk about a 4th one in production. I would use there's a webhook you can drive off comments, and in the past, in the banking world, I've seen people use the comments webhook to put in, like, the change ID of the production change that you're going through. Okay, and then as part of your pipeline, you can go and validate that change in ServiceNow or whatever your change tool is, right? I don't have that today, but that's just another thing I'd probably be using in the real world. So tag, release, merge, pull, push, right? These are the webhooks that we're going to be driving our pipelines with. Right, so let's look at the CI/CD solution. Okay, so my CI/CD solution, I use what is a central repository to basically register all my applications. Now, again, this might not be how you've seen it done in the past. This is quite an opinionated approach to CI/CD. But up top here, I'm going to have this central repository. And inside this repository is just a Helm chart. Remember, we talked about Helm in Git or Helm in the Helm repository. This Helm chart in this Git repository is basically going to be divided up into teams. I separate the values file for my Helm chart into teams, okay? And each of those teams is going to get a folder within this Helm chart to basically put in their values and register all their applications, okay? I could have 500 teams and 2,000 applications here, right? You probably wouldn't want it that big in a really major organization. Maybe you'd have multiple Argo CDs and multiple setups like this. But a medium-sized company, a couple of 100 teams and a few hundred applications, this is probably the right size for a single Argo CD. Okay, so this first application is going to be installed onto my cluster, right? And I did that as part of my GitHub Actions pipeline that we ran at the start, where we provisioned the cluster and the network. We also installed this first application, and we're going to run 4 loops inside this first application to iterate through those teams, pull out all the configs, and deploy more things. Okay, so this Git repo is going to tell Argo CD about other repos and other Helm repositories. Okay, now down the bottom here, I've got my online boutique application that we've talked about today that we're deploying. I split out my applications to have a single repository per microservice. As we spoke about earlier, we've got 11 microservices today in the online boutique application. But then I also have a central CD repository. And for me, that is the happy place between pure DevOps and how things were done in the past. I know some people just have single repository that does their CI and CD for each microservice. But I've found with big multi-microservice architectures, when you've got 40 microservices, right, it's people don't want to have this singular CD process per microservice, right? But at the same time, you want the benefits of DevOps and being able to promote a single microservice. That's why we broke them down for monolithics, right? So, but this is really is the happy place between how we did things in the past and how we want to do things with DevOps, right? Here I can apply change control, right? I can do a release of software, but I can also promote an individual microservice. Right? So on this screen, I've only got one application, but potentially here there's, there'd be hundreds of applications, right? This Git repo would reference. I've also got some Helm charts that Git's pointing to, the Helm repo, okay? There's also a Docker repository that we're going to be using on Artifactory. It's another bolt-on that comes with Arrow. it can be deployed as an operator. And so once this central repository tells Argo CD where everything else is, Argo CD is going to go and point to those things, and it's going to sync it to the cluster. Okay, that's how it's fundamentally going to be working. Okay. And as I mentioned earlier, I've got these 3 Tecton pipelines doing the CI side of it. So that was the CD. The CI side of it, I've got a Helm chart that's going to, a Tecton pipeline that's going to be promoting my Helm charts, publishing my Helm charts as they change. I've got a single pipeline per microservice that is promoting my artifact. Remember, we talked about the tag and release webhook, right? So on a release of some code and changes to a microservice, I'm going to be driving the promotion of that Helm chart and that artifact. And as part of that, I'm also going to have an option to promote it to live, right? So the way I do it is I actually go in and change the tags within the CD repository. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. On the CD side, though, is the complete CD process, okay, which also includes other things like infrastructure. Applications need infrastructure in the cloud, right? So here I'm building potentially secrets, right? I'm building databases, right? I'm building permissions and things that I need for my application to function, okay? And also potentially Liquibase and API gateway loads, right? An application, a big major application in the banking or the finance world, there's a lot more to it than just the microservices, right? Kafka, API gateways, databases, etc. So again, that's another reason why I split the CD out, right? And I have a separate repository for this because it manages everything else. So one repo to rule them all. I put this slide in here just to delve a bit more into into what this single repo is, where I register all my applications. And we're actually going to jump into YAML after this slide. It's the only time I jump into YAML. I find that when you're presenting a CI/CD solution like this, it's pretty hectic and it's hard to understand. I certainly wouldn't understand someone else explaining this to me for the first time. So we're going to try and avoid YAML as much as we can. But it's all about the concepts, right? So this central repository is basically going to be a gateway to my clusters, right? In my solution, no one really has any higher level privileges on the cluster itself or Argo CD, right? No one's ClickOpsing anything, right? I'm all about infrastructure as code and GitOps, right? Everything's in code, right? And this central repository is going to be the gateway to my clusters. Okay, so here we are in VS Code. And as I said, this is a Helm chart in a Git repo, right? And it's got a values file and a chart.yaml with its version. It has some templates that actually are the YAML manifests that we're going to deliver. And in my solution, like I said, I've got 3 teams defined here, okay? And then I've got a folder structure above that has some files in it that will be basically our values file for all the Helm charts that are going to be deployed for our applications, okay? This team here, OBT, I've used as my online banking, my online boutique application team. Okay, I've got a sandbox environment, I've got a non-prod environment. The cluster is the name of the cluster that we're deploying to. I've only got one cluster today, so they're all got the same one. This third team down here, I've sort of called this DevOps, right? For every cluster, I'm going to need a team defined to basically do all day 2 activities for the cluster itself. Okay, so this whole solution isn't just about deploying applications. It's also about everything that happens on the cluster, right? Infrastructure that needs to be deployed there. Tweaking of configurations. Okay, and we're going to have a quick look at the types of things I'm going to be deploying. So first up, let's look at the DevOps one. Right, this is the cluster one per you need one of these per cluster. Okay, there are some pipelines here that I've defined. Okay, these are the pipelines we spoke about for Helm Promote. Okay, this is the Helm Promote pipeline. okay? And I have a bunch of pipelines. I GitOps my pipelines, right? So I'm using GitOps to deploy a Helm chart that's going to run a pipeline that's going to promote my Helm charts, right? And I've got one of these for some of the base Argo applications, and I've also got the tech time pipelines one. And I've got a whole slide dedicated to my pipelines, and we're going to talk about them in a few minutes' time. But I just wanted to show you how I'm configuring these things. Okay, and there is a little chicken and egg here, because this Helm chart has to exist before it can promote the Helm charts, right? And I'll talk about that later. OCP configuration. I'm deploying a service mesh control plane here. Again, it's just a Helm chart I've created, right, that I'm able to deploy. There are a bunch of other Helm charts that I'm deploying here, right, for this cluster. Sealed secrets. I use two types of secrets in my CI/CD solutions. You know, I don't want to pay for cloud secrets, right? So I use sealed secrets where anything's going to be static. Okay, if a secret needs to rotate, right, then I use cloud secrets, and I use something like external secrets. Okay, I'm also using reloader here to restart my pods when things change, and I'm also using Argo CD rollouts. Okay, so let's move on to what the actual OBT non-prod one looks like. This is my online boutique application. So in here, I am again just setting up a whole heap of values for this application team to deploy its applications. Okay, and this covers the namespaces. This covers my Istio ingress configurations and egress configurations. These keywords, right, are going to drive Helm charts further along. My network policies. This is all about what workload isolation and encryption. Okay, Istio for the encryption, right? Ingress and egress connections, right? And then I've got my microservices defined, right? I've got a microservice defined for all 11 microservices that make up the product, right? And this is just one environment. It's my dev environment. If I was to have more environments, I would just basically cut and paste this whole thing underneath, and that would deploy other environments, right? But this is a central way of configuring everything I need about my online boutique application, okay? In this file, I've got my pipelines, right? Remember we talked about the artifact promote, okay? Builder build is the name of my Helm chart that promotes my artifacts, right? I've got one for each of my microservices to the promotion, and then I've got that CD pipeline down the bottom, right? Okay, so again, they're just Helm charts. And what I love about GitOpsing pipelines is that they are going to be reused for everyone else's applications, right? I don't want people to be building their own pipelines and wasting time doing that, right, in my organization. I want to build the pipelines once, and then everyone consume them, right? If I've got, 100 application teams, and I've got these great pipeline Helm charts that they can just consume and use this process for all their applications, you know, think about how much money that saves you, right? Of people not wasting their time building their own pipelines, right? And it's totally possible to build pipelines that cater for everything in your environment, right? I've literally got 3 pipelines I've built for this this process, and it would serve all my applications, right? So it's very powerful GitOps, because, you know, it's all about in this solution, it's all about reusability. Okay, so I just want to dive in here now. This one's where it's going to get a little bit hectic. Okay, so this is what an Argo CD application looks like, right? And we talked about for loops before, right? For each of my teams, right, defined in my values file, teams, I am going to be iterating through and creating an Argo CD application that's going to take that teams folder and their values file and pass it through to the next loop. And we're going to talk a little bit about this further down the track, and it's going to make a bit more sense. I just wanted to give you some idea of what's going on here, right? This is what this Helm chart and the fundamental building block of this solution is. It's going to iterate through my teams, take all the configuration for those teams, and then pass it on through to a whole heap of what I would describe as a payload of Argo CD applications, right? And those Argo CD applications are all going to have a one-to-one mapping with a different Helm chart, which is going to deliver different applications onto the cluster relevant to that application. Next up, we're talking about the Tecton pipelines that make up my solution. So as I said, I've got 3 pipelines. I've got 2 of them on the page here. I've got another page we're going to jump to in a second. So the initial Helm promote, right? It's very basic, right? When I make a commit to my repository, I'm going to fetch my code, I'm going to lint it, and then I'm going to promote that Helm chart if the version of the chart has changed. Right? Very basic, right? The fundamental building block. I've got the chicken and egg up here just because when I first set all this up, I need to promote those Helm charts first, right? And I have a Helm repository that sits outside of my Kubernetes cluster. And I previously, before I built my clusters, I promoted those Helm charts manually because, you know, they need to be there initially so that they can be used to promote the Helm charts, right? So it's a real chicken and egg thing, okay? Next up, we've got the tag release, the microservice artifact promote, fundamental, you know, the build, right? This is where we build our container from our code, right? In here, I've got a fetch repository. I run my unit tests. I lint my code, and then I do a SonarQube scan, okay? All happens before I build my image. Next up is the build, where we build our image, and we promote that image to a container registry. Here we have the security scans that happen before that can be promoted. Okay, I'm using ACS. You know, whatever your flavor is, ACS is a Red Hat product. It's #1 in the market. It's a fantastic tool for runtime security scanning, also for scanning your containers for vulnerabilities, etc. Okay, malware, that sort of thing. And finally, in this pipeline, I've got this custom promote, right? So back when we were looking in the YAML before, I can tell one of those pipelines, right, for per microservice, which environments it should auto promote to. And when I promote, what I'm promoting to is to this CD repository, right? And we talked about the third one, the CD one. It's a central one that covers all the microservices per application. And it covers all environments, right? So the way this one works is we have protected branches per environment, dev, sit, UAT, prod, right? Those are the protected branches. And for each of those branches, this pipeline will generate a branch per microservice. So if I've got 4 protected branches, so 4 environments, I'll have the 4 protected branches plus 11 microservice branches per those 4, right? So in total, you would have, what's that, 4 plus 44, 48, something like that, okay? So, and Argo CD is going to be pointed at those microservice branches. That's what it's actually going to be syncing, okay? So what does this CD pipeline do? We do a fetch repository, and then we just update the branches. Now, this one is driven off a push, and that's what happens when I do my custom promote from here, right? It pushes to my CD repository. It generates those branches or refreshes those branches with the change tag of the container, okay? But if I run it as a merge request or a pull request, right? So when I want to do something a bit more fundamental than just promote my a new version of the Docker or the container, right? I want to, do a proper build. Here I'm doing the merge request, and that webhook triggers my TF2nd, my linting, and then runs my Terraform plan and my Liquibase plan, right? So this is where I'm doing some more fundamental changes, right? Maybe I'm tweaking some infrastructure or building something new or building a new environment, or I'm updating my database schema, right? It's the same pipeline. It's just triggered in a different way, okay? Finally, when I'm ready to merge that change in, when I've reviewed my Terraform plan and my Liquibase plan, maybe I've updated some tags that I don't auto push, right, for my containers. Maybe I've updated some environment variables per microservice, right? I'm ready to roll. Maybe I'm releasing code under change, right? Then I merge that request in, okay? And that kicks off this route in the pipeline, right? Fetch repository, Terraform apply, build my infrastructure, right? Update my secrets, whatever I'm doing. Do my schema management, right? Update all the database schema. Run that branch update again, right? Refresh all my branches with change tags and change environment variables, right? And then maybe I'm doing some sort of API gateway load, right? Or generating Kafka topics. I don't know, whatever else is in your solution, right? There'll be other things in here that sit outside the microservices that need to be handled, right? And I've just put API gateway in here as an example of something you might do, okay? Okay, so we are back in the deck again. This is the GitOps workflow where I hopefully will sum everything up together and it will start fully making sense. Over on the left-hand side here, we've got the cluster build. We went through that. We built the network. We built the OpenShift Arrow cluster. We did this with Bicep, right? We did some initial configuration with Helm charts. We just installed a Helm chart of all our operators, right, to set up the cluster. And then as part of that cluster build, we deployed first application. First application was the one we went through in VS Code, right? This is where I defined my teams, and each of those teams then had a folder with all their configurations, which defined their environments and their microservices, right? So I had 3 teams, right? Let's jump into the GitOps UI, the Argo CD UI, and have a look at what that looks like. So if I go back into applications, I go into first. If I search on first, here's first. This is the first application we deployed. This is the VS Code that we looked at, right? It then for looped through my 3 teams, right? If I had 100 teams, there'd be 100 of these, right? These are just other Argo CD applications. They are pointers to my payload, and we're about to go through that, okay? Over on the right-hand side is my payload, right? For each of my teams, they are going to receive all of these Argo CD applications. And these Argo CD applications are driven off those keywords that we saw defined in those folders for each team, right? Microservices, pipelines, Istio ingress, Istio egress, right? The keywords set up the values that were passed into these Argo CD applications that map to a Helm chart. The ones in red here in the middle, the gray with the red, they are all basically leaf nodes of this solution. They actually deploy a Helm chart that deploys something, as opposed to this third application down the bottom, which is a pointer to yet another Argo CD application. And that's where the CD repository that we've been talking about through this presentation comes into its own. There's a branch for every microservice per environment in that CD that contains the 4th application, which is another Argo CD application. And we're going to look at that in a sec. So second, let's look at OBT non-prod again. Second, here's the payload being deployed, right? All of these are Argo CD applications that are created based on the folder for OBT non-prod, which is my online boutique application. Let's now look at third. Third, as we said, we've got lots of thirds, okay? There's one for every microservice, and it's a pointer to the branch where that application is. This one's AD service, right? If we quickly flick back into VS Code and into my micro environments, here's AD service. We're passing the Helm chart and we're calling this branch, okay? Dev non-prod app AD service. Getting into the repository itself, here is the online boutique CD repository. Here is my protected branch. I have a folder for each microservice. In the folder is all it is that the values, the environment variables that they need, and most importantly, the tag. This is the one I update when I publish a new version of my artifact, my container. And then I have the values file, okay? The values file, the environment variables are all merged into a new Helm chart, which is just another Argo CD application on this branch, okay? That's all it is. And what does that look like? When we go into the UI, we search on fourth. Fourth AD service is actually the delivery of my container and the Helm chart. Why do I do it like this, right? What are the benefits? I'm reusing all my Argo CD applications and no one of my developers ever see one, right? They are masked away, okay? And that's a really big benefit. And also we're using all the YAML again, over and over again, right? Which when I reduce the amount of YAML I'm deploying, it makes it a lot easier to support, right? Okay. Another reason why I love it, at the end of my cloud journey, everything, all my applications and teams are listed in one repository and all the configurations for my applications. And that's very powerful for one reason in particular. It is the ideal building block for an IDP. an internal development platform. There's a lot of talk about them at the moment. An IDP is like DevOps Havana, right? Where I can come into a UI as a developer and build a project by answering some questionnaires in a form and set up all my environments, right? And this whole process I've talked about today is an ideal building block for an IDP.
Wow. Yeah, hectic. I think that's a good word to describe that session, Paul. Thanks a lot for that. Really showed a lot of capabilities in that session. Look, Paul, we could absolutely talk for forever about this, but I am conscious that we probably had some questions during the show, so we're going to switch over to a live Q&A in a moment.
Okay. Cool.
But what I wanted to do was the show note log is on the screen there. That first link, we'll be putting plenty of follow-up information there. We went deep today during the show, so if you've got questions that we don't get to during either the live Q&A or we've answered during the show, please check out the show notes and we'll put follow-up answers to those questions there. Paul, it's been fantastic to have you on the show today. Really appreciate your time. I'll see you in a moment in the live Q&A, but thanks a lot.
Hey everybody, welcome to our live Q&A today. I'm joined by Paul, who just ran us through that fantastic session on GitOps using Azure Red Hat OpenShift. There was a lot of content in there and we had some good questions from the audience. So Paul, welcome, let's get into it.
Hey Simon, sure.
There was let's start with that question from a member of the audience, which was, what's the difference between CI/CD in the context of something like, say, GitHub Actions versus CI/CD in the context of Argo CD that you showed quite heavily during the session?
Sure. Okay. GitHub Actions is really like the equivalent of, in my solution, Tekton. I mean, when we initially built that cluster at the start, I did actually use GitHub Actions, and the reason we use GitHub Actions there is because Tekton is a cloud-native pipeline technology, and it requires the cluster to be run on. Okay, it's driven by webhooks, and that's how it works. It's cloud-native. It runs on Kubernetes. So I couldn't use it until I'd built a cluster, right? And like I said, it's driven by webhooks, and I can wrap them in Helm charts. The pipelines themselves, I can wrap them in Helm charts and deploy them on Kubernetes through GitOps, right? So there's some big advantages there. There's also big advantages of using GitHub Actions, right? GitHub Actions has the pipeline technology baked into Git, right? And there are big advantages of that. I would say Tekton and GitHub Actions, they're strong in different areas, right? But when it comes to the CD component, what separates Argo CD out and makes it so fantastic is that the credentials for the deployment are held by Argo CD, okay? It's in one place, right? It fosters least privileged access, right? If I had to do my CD, my delivery through GitHub Actions, that would require the actual pipeline in GitHub to connect to the cluster, right? So that's a bit of a disadvantage for me. But more importantly, if I deploy Helm charts or deploy Kubernetes configuration or whatever I'm deploying to Kubernetes via a pipeline, right? My Kubernetes cluster is a collection of pipelines run in time, okay? It's a point in time of something that was deployed to the cluster, and it'll be a collection of those things over time, which means you don't really have control or visibility of what's on the cluster, as opposed to syncing Git, right? Argo CD syncs the live state of branches on Git repositories, right? What's in Git is what is on my cluster, and I talked about that at the start. The power of GitOps and power of Argo CD for me is all about bringing ephemeral workloads and Kubernetes clusters, which is a game changer in the banking world, in many organizations around the world, and marrying up that with the power of Git and version control. We're marrying those two things together, as opposed to delivering point-in-time pipelines to the cluster.
Yeah.
Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, look, I think even at the most basic level for me, looking at the difference is that, when you talk about the Red Hat OpenShift platform, the value that it brings, outside of that core Kubernetes capability is these packaged, offerings like Argo CD and I think you then build a reliance on a Git provider. You know, in today's case, we talked about GitHub, but it could be that you're pulling from any Git repository, either, you know, on-prem, privately hosted, or SaaS provider of some sort.
Yep.
And with Argo CD and Tekton as your technology mix, you know, you're literally agnostic to where that source code lives. But, you know, just your explanation there, right? You know, you've got now Tekton doing CI, and you've got Argo CD doing CD, and then also Argo CD is more than just this idea of an orchestrator to deploy something somewhere. There's, you know, projects and metadata and a lot of stuff there. So I think it's a deeper, richer, broader, you know, offering than, say, GitHub Actions in the CD world, at least at the moment. I think there's probably,
I think so. I think the GitOps itself. I saw some stats on it the other day, and they're saying I think it was like don't quote me on this, but by 2025 it was going to be like 30% of organizations will be doing some form of GitOps, you know, in their delivery of applications, right? It's on the rise. This is the moment where things are heading. For that continuous delivery component.
So look, you know, again, we could talk infinite time about CI/CD in this context. The other question, which was tied to pipelines, was you talked about open source offer called Liquibase, and the question was, you know, you talk about Liquibase in the context of pipelines. What are you using Liquibase for in this context?
Yep. Okay. Great question. So, for people that don't know Liquibase, it's about schema management, right? Database schema management. It's basically like a little Java bin thing and command line utility, and it's a process for updating schemas in databases and also rolling them back. Okay, and it's quite a rich command line set that's involved with it. Now, what's wonderful about it is it's great for pipelines, and it allows you to start, you know, moving your management of your database schema into your pipeline process, right? Which is where we want everything to be. You know, you can see in my solution, I'm trying to build infrastructure and manage my database and do everything in that's associated with that application in one place, right? So it's not perfect. It's open source. There is a pro license you can get. I've never used that, to be honest. But there's two commands that I use a lot, and one of them in particular is fantastic. It's called update SQL, and it allows you to basically do like if anyone's familiar with Terraform, and I talked about that earlier as well. It allows you to do a plan, right? It's sort of like it's like the Terraform plan. It's like, what if I run this pipeline now and run this SQL command? You know, what is actually going to happen to my schema, right? It's going to list out before I do anything. It's going to tell me what it's going to do, right? So I've got an opportunity to review that, right? Which I love, and I love that about Terraform as well. Now, the other thing it does is, as we were talking about before, the power of Git and version control, marrying that up with ephemeral workloads. We're doing the same thing here, except with our database schema, right? So Liquibase is going to take what's in Git. I'm going to have all my SQL in Git in little files, and it's going to have this thing called a change log, and it's going to sequentially apply these change sets of SQL to my database, right? And in the way it does that in sequential, and you can't go back and alter those scripts, right? So it's constantly moving forward in the changelog and building that database in an identical fashion. Why is that important? It's important because in every one of my environments, I want my database to be identical, right? And this is again about version control. Not only is all my SQL in Git, right, but my actual process of building that database is going to be identical between environments. It can't be changed, right? The change log always moves forward, right? So when I do when I create some SQL, I put it in my file, and I mentioned this in the new file in my changelog. I'm going to run this update SQL on the merge requests, right? It's going to say, these are the things I'm going to change in your database. I'm going to review that and I'm going to go, fantastic, approve. So, and then I'm going to merge that into the protected branch, and it's going to drive the second webhook, which is going to run a liquid-based command called update. And in the update, it's going to then go and update my database schema, and then then that's the change done, and that might marry up with some other changes to code that you've made against some microservices, right? That are also going to be updated at the same time.
That's quite an in-depth description of liquid-based. I think there are
but
yeah, there's a few products out there and open source offerings like liquid-based that can do this. I think the note I make there is that it's not something you just enable on your environment if you don't have the right process and approach to doing database management and change management in the database world. So often, I see in the developer world, people are like, oh, magically, I've got this thing that will take care of all the database changes for each one of the changes that I'm pushing through in code. And generally, that's not how it works. It might work for simple changes in simple environments, but when you've got database tables with millions of rows and you're making changes to those tables, there's more than just running a simple SQL command. There's also other things to take into consideration. But I must admit, I hadn't heard of liquid-based before, and it's nice that we have another tool in our toolkit that we can use to do that sort of stuff.
Yeah, look, definitely.
We're running low on time, but I know there was some questions about access to slides and source code. There is a bunch of source code links and samples up on the show notes. Paul mentioned at the top of his talk the baseline project that he was using for his demo. So that's the online boutique. Look, Red Hat and Microsoft are committed to making Azure Red Hat OpenShift, the place to bring your OpenShift workloads to. So hopefully over time, you'll see code such as the demo that Paul did today. However, if you do want to talk more to Paul about getting access to his slides or his code, or even to Paul's brain, right? Because the slides on their own, code on their own, are not going to do much for you unless you can ask someone questions. Reach out to Paul. His LinkedIn profile is up on the show notes as well, and I'm sure he'll be happy to answer your questions. We've got just over 3 minutes left, so I know that you touched briefly at the end there on your session about this concept of the internal development platform, or IDP. I think this is probably your key area of interest at the moment, so I want to give you a couple of minutes to go a little bit deeper on that, talk to us about that, and then we'll wrap up after that.
Yeah, sure. At the last organisation I worked at, we were talking about building one. I think many organisations are on that path. There's a fantastic product that Red Hat's just gotten behind and started contributing to. It's an open source product for building IDPs. It's called Backstage. I've personally, I haven't actually built one myself. I want to build one for this solution. I think it forms the ideal building block for that. And an IDP basically is like someone's going to come along. You're going to have this basically a front end portal where developers can come along and they can describe their project through some sort of form and that interacts with them and ask them questions. And then it can go off and spit out all their environments, right? Spit out their GitHub repositories, create all those pipelines and all that configuration we saw. A lot of that, it's the same between all applications, right? And I find that in my experience, when you get DevOps right, and platform engineering right, a lot of different applications start to look the same from that DevOps perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's all about, again, I've talked about this throughout the presentation about driving down my labor, right? If I've got this Backstage IO interface that my devs can interact with, and they can shave off a month of building all that configuration out by just answering some questions, that's very powerful, right? That's going to drive down a lot of costs and resources, because my wage bill dwarfs my infrastructure costs, right? And that's true at all organizations, right? You might purchase Arrow and it's going to save you resources, right? And you might if you get your DevOps and platform engineering right, it's going to save you resources, and that finance is going to dwarf your infrastructure costs.
Yeah, and it's also going to free up your skilled resources to work on the more impactful stuff rather than just doing the sausage factory work, right? Look,
yeah, and that's the most important thing, Simon. To be honest, that's a fantastic point.
Less than 1 minute, and we've got one question. I'll give you 30 seconds to see if you can answer this one. So if you've got hundreds of microservices and only one trigger to change through a pull request, how does Argo CD pipeline take? Does the Argo CD pipeline take time to reach the change that triggered the deployment? Now, I don't know if you can answer that question. If not, we'll push it to the show notes.
So there's different ways to sync it. You, as part of your pipeline, you can go and tell Argo CD to sync immediately, right? So there is an option there. I am going to put that into my solution at some point and use Argo CD rollouts, which I didn't get to. But at the moment, I'm just doing auto sync. It just kicks off after a point in time.
All right. Okay. So 10 seconds to go. Paul, thank you very much for today's show. Check out the show notes, everybody, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks a lot, Paul.
Thanks, guys. See you later.